All right, so we're at a point now where some of the largest companies in the world are tech companies. And they're growing in power, and they're achieving levels of scale that we've never seen before. We used to call them unicorns because they were kind of rare to see, and now they've become routine. And these companies have a pretty huge influence on our daily lives, sometimes even if we aren't directly their customers. And for some companies, it's actually hard not to be their customers. And we spend so much time being at all these companies' success that I don't think we spend enough time actually wondering about the consequences of that scale. We've kind of just internalized this belief that tech at scale is good. But we know that scale doesn't make great products or companies. McDonald's makes food at scale, and I don't think anyone that's not a child would consider it to be the best or high quality food. I don't think I've ever met someone who actually likes Comcast or AT&T, even though they both run at scale. So I'm going to walk you through the histories of 3 different companies that are each running at scale, each one bigger than the last, so that we can kind of explore some of the consequences that scale has. The first company I want to talk about is Walmart. If you aren't familiar with Walmart, they are a store that you can walk into and you can walk out with a cake, a pizza, a Nintendo Switch, and some prescription drugs, all in one place. But they started out from humble beginnings. They were just a single shop in Arkansas, and they aimed to differentiate themselves by selling everything a little bit cheaper than competitors, and they would do that by keeping their costs low. And Walmart is very good at keeping costs low. They're always on the lookout for inefficiencies, and that's how they're able to do this. For instance, they would ask deodorant makers to stop shipping deodorant in these extra little boxes because you just buy the deodorant, throw the box away, and they realized that was just wasting a few cents every unit. This is an interesting one. They had General Mills redesign the noodles for hamburger helpers so they packed a little bit more tightly in their boxes. And that means that they spend about a million pounds less of paper each year, which is the equivalent of taking about 500 semi-trucks off the road each year. They're using more efficient equipment in their stores, and they're even installing solar panels now. So having like a razor-sharp focus like that on lowering costs has made Walmart the biggest retailer in the US, and for a while they were the biggest company in the world. They are the biggest private employer in the US. They've got over 1 million employees just in their stores alone. And there's nothing inherently wrong with trying to lower prices or get rid of inefficiencies, but when you try to do it at scale, things start to become a little bit unhinged. As Walmart grew by running themselves more efficiently, they started to gain more leverage with their suppliers, and they used their leverage. For instance, in the late 90s, they started experimenting with pickle prices, and they found out that they did some experiments. They found out that if you tried to sell a gallon of pickles for around $3, sales would shoot way up. So Walmart approached Vlasic, the top pickle maker in the US, and they said, we want to take this price nationwide. And when Walmart asks you to do that, you have to say yes, because if you say no, Walmart will just stop buying your products, and usually Walmart's your biggest customer. So Vlasic went for it, and in 1998, every store in Walmart had gallon-sized jars of pickles for $2.97. And Vlasic would make maybe a penny or two of profit on each jar. And indeed, they did sell like gangbusters, but no one actually really benefited from this low price. Vlasic was not a beneficiary of this. It cannibalized their sales in other grocery stores where they were more profitable. Their revenue went way up, but their profits went way down. And it's actually a really big strain on the company to supply that many pickles to Walmart. Walmart wasn't making money on these either because it was kind of a vanity project. And customers didn't benefit either because who really needs a gallon of pickles? The pickles didn't get this cheap because of the market creating that price. It was just an invention of Walmart's. So people would go and see this cheap price. They'd be like, you'd be crazy to pass up that deal. So they buy the jar of pickles, sits in their fridge for a few months, and then they go bad. Eventually, Walmart stopped selling these, but shortly after that, Vlasic ended up filing for bankruptcy. You might say things went sour for them. They got themselves into a real pickle. Those are the only 2 puns I have for the entire talk, I promise. Walmart pushes their suppliers for lower prices every year. And at first, this is okay. There's always some inefficiencies to be ironed out, but pretty soon you iron out all those inefficiencies, and then Walmart wants more low prices every year. They want usually 5% less each year. And eventually, you feel the pressure, and you just stop making things in the US, and you start shipping overseas because that's the only way you can make your prices lower. Some suppliers will just go under because they can't keep up. Nowadays, cheap bicycles get shipped across oceans, and I'm guessing that uses a lot more fuel than we ever saved by packing those hamburger helper noodles a little bit tighter. And that's the thing about scale. Like, it takes a good thing, and it kind of just destroys the environment in the process. And so the end effect of this is we got Walmart running as a sprawling multinational corporation. They've brought in over $500 billion in revenue last year, which is more than any other company brings in. But their margins are super thin. They only made $3.8 billion in profit of $514 billion in revenue. And to get that $3.8 billion, which is a large sum of money, but they have to put the squeeze on literally every supplier they work with to get that $3.8 billion. And so if you look at what that scale means, that means like we think Walmart should pay their workers more, but they really can't because they've got $3.8 billion in profit. If they put all that money into payroll for their stores, they could maybe raise wages by $1 an hour. And if they wanted to get to like $15 an hour, which people say is a good living wage, Walmart would need to probably triple their net profit margin just to break even. And that's just talking about people in Walmart stores. It's not even talking about people in the rest of the supply chain who are also vastly underpaid. And so that's what Walmart scale looks like. You lower prices at scale and it has a shrinking effect on the global economy. They do lower prices and they keep them low, which is not necessarily what you expect from like really big companies, but you're basically pushing down on wages and profits for everyone around you to get those low prices. When Walmart opens a store in a town, the net job gains are there, but they're very modest, and usually you lose about 5 other stores in that town in the process. So US taxpayers are also kind of paying for these low prices because we'll spend about $6.2 billion a year in government subsidies for people who work in Walmart stores because they don't make enough to make ends meet, which means that we're basically subsidizing Walmart's operations to the tune of more than they make in profit because they only made about $3.8 billion in profit. And that brings a whole new meaning to the phrase economies of scale. Next, let's talk about Google. In their early days, I think Google was super awesome. Like all the other search engines at the time really sucked. They were cluttered, they were full of ads, and the search results were really lousy. But Google came along and they were nice and they were very minimalist. And their search results pages were clean and they had super useful results. They were a fun and whimsical company. They did fun homepage decorations for the holidays and such. They did April Fool's Day jokes back when that was fun to do. And like a job at the Googleplex was the envy of almost any nerd. And they made money, and they made money by selling ads, but they were very scrupulous about it. They wanted to make sure that they kept their advertising and their search results separate. They didn't want to sell search results. And when they entered new businesses, it was great. Like Gmail was fantastic. It was easily 10 times better than the rest. And Google grew a lot throughout the 2000s, but eventually this catches up with you because eventually everyone's using Google and there are no new customers for them to grow with. And eventually you get to be so big that it's actually hard to grow like a few percent every year. Like 5% of $943 billion is close to $50 billion, and that's a lot to eke out of the market every year. So Google does what a lot of companies do when they're at scale and they need to keep growing, which is they enter new businesses by acquiring other companies. You might think that scale makes you more capable of doing new things and trying new things, but really what just happens is you wait for other companies to try new things and you buy them. And Google did try a couple in-house initiatives like Google Plus and probably like a dozen messaging services. Google's become kind of hostile to the open web. Like originally they were a friend of it because they were a search company and you need a good open web for a good search company. But they started building their own web browser. They gave it great market share by basically like telling every Google search user to download their browser, and now they give it preferential treatment over other browsers. They built a technology called AMP, which makes mobile pages load faster, which you don't need a special technology to do, but when you're Google, you need to do that because you need to find a way to insert yourself into the process so that you can, cement your stranglehold on analytics and ads on the web. And they got publishers to sign on to this when, publishers really only need to make their pages less bloated for mobile pages to load faster, but Google promised them higher search results placement. So they went for it. And that means that independent publishers on the web are now a little bit less independent. Google Search itself used to be a kickoff place to the rest of the web where you can actually use the web. But now, instead of just kicking you off to your destination, they just extract the information out of those destination pages and surface it into the search results page, which means that if I go through the work of making this recipe, Google's just going to show the answer, and then I'll get robbed of that page click. Ads, if you recall, Google used to be very proud of keeping their ads visually very distinct. Nowadays, they are quite similar to regular search results. And they're similar enough now to the point where you actually, if you're a company, you'll feel forced to take out ads on your own company name just so that you can appear at the top of the search results when someone Googles your name. And Google keeps looking for growth in unfortunate places. A couple years ago, they decided maybe, there's about 750 million new Chinese internet users, and Google kind of wanted to get after that, even though they said they wouldn't back in 2010. So they started looking at building a new search engine that, from the ground up, was designed with government censorship in mind. That project has been canceled. They also started looking into providing AI to the military. And some Google employees are looking at unionizing, and Google did what big companies do, which is starting to union bust and fire people that try to do that. And that's what scale does to you. You go from being this fun, whimsical company that everyone loves, and then you become 2 orders of magnitude larger, and then you're angling to become a military contractor. Finally, I want to talk about Apple. And as you might see, I am a big Apple nerd. I was using Macs way before it was cool for web developers to use Macs. So that's going to kind of color how I see things. And when I talk about Apple reaching scale, I'm mostly talking about the last 10 years or so when they started selling lots of iPhones. In the late 90s, Steve Jobs returned to Apple after they were kind of on the rocks. And he was able to get Apple kind of back into order, and they established themselves as a design and technical leader. They ruthlessly cut their product line to just 4 products, consumer desktops and laptops, and pro desktops and laptops. And this worked. These were very bold computers, and they made headlines. When they stabilized, they looked at making a music player. They acquired SoundJam, and then they made iTunes. Then after that, they made the iPod, which did very well. And then they also started selling music, and that did very well. Still, they weren't super big. But then the iPhone came out, which would turn Apple into a $1 trillion company. In the early 2000s, Apple was a tiny fraction of its current size, but they had huge technical prowess. They built OS X. They were able to transition their entire Mac lineup into Intel processors, and all their first-party apps were beautifully designed, and they were something that third-party developers would look to as a good reference design for an app. Steve Jobs would often remark on the fact that Apple didn't have the R&D resources that Microsoft had, but they got a lot of bang for their buck. But some cracks started to appear when the iPhone came out. It just started becoming obvious that Apple was getting stretched a little bit thin. So they started moving engineers to help with the iPhone OS before the iPhone was released. And nowadays, Apple's got 6 times as many employees as they had when the iPhone first came out. And they've kind of stabilized things, but they're still very stretched thin. Their product lines get very inconsistent amounts of attention now. The iPhone, which is their moneymaker, is coming out every year like clockwork, but other products like the iPad are a little bit more sporadic. And the Mac is very sporadic, which is kind of sad because if you took the Mac business as its own company, it would be a Fortune 500 company. So that's kind of a lot of neglect for a product line that brings in that much money. Apple's software quality has been suffering across the board, even their iPhone software. Apple's trying to do a lot of things at once, and they're doing them all really poorly. Their developer tools are also in disarray. Xcode's instability is a running joke in the developer community. It's been that way for probably like a decade now. APIs are buggy, poorly documented. The bug tracking system is frustrating to use. It's hard to get a reply. And instead of trying to focus on things and get their house in order, Apple instead is just pushing into new business after new business. They're looking at making a car. They built a bunch of subscription services. Now they're a credit card company. And they're just going to keep neglecting these core businesses until it becomes an existential threat to them again. From a design point of view, they're no longer the leader they used to be. Their software is kind of lazy, and the design choices are kind of lazy. And actually, third parties are the ones that are making some of the nicer apps nowadays. Their industrial design is usually very good, but when they make a mistake, it takes years for them to correct it, even though they're a $1 trillion company. So at the risk of sounding dramatic, I think Apple's lost their soul. Just existing every day at scale is costing Apple all their energy, and they have to put all that energy into keeping themselves running. They're big enough to be a country now, and there is at least one news site on the internet that's now going to report on them as though they are, because they've got a larger market cap than the GDPs of many countries. And so Apple's skills turn them from being this cultural, technical, and design leader into being a big, boring corporation that does really disappointing things. They'll spend years making minor revisions to a laptop keyboard they know their customers hate and isn't reliable. I'm really bitter about that if you didn't notice. Then 3 years later, they'll pull a new Coke and then bring back the old design, and everyone will rejoice. They have sophisticated corporate tax dodges. They'll accept hundreds of millions of dollars from a small town in Iowa that doesn't have the money to spare so that they can build a data center that will bring them 50 jobs that they would have built anyway. They invest all these person hours into building a secure enclave into the iPhone to protect your data, but then they just design iOS to back up all your data into iCloud, where Apple has a key to everything. And then they'll run an ad campaign that says what happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone. It's really easy to feel powerless against all these massive tech companies that are here at scale, but I don't feel powerless. This is a systemic problem, and you can't just fight systemic problems with individual action. But I'm going to try doing it anyway. And I target using products that are low scale personally. I use an app called Overcast to listen to my podcast, for instance. It's made by one developer, and it's got features that Apple can't even have in their podcast app. If I want to do remote pairing, I'll use an app called Tuple, which is made by 3 people that have never taken VC money. And they've got a better remote pairing product than Slack or Zoom, which are massive companies. I buy DRM-free stuff from small independent sites. I use RSS to get my news instead of going to big social networks. And most importantly, I pay for things more. Because I think that when I pay people for things, it means I'm supporting them and it means that they work for me. I made this talk using a lot of different indie software. And the thing is, these choices aren't a sacrifice to me. They're better products overall. And as enthusiasts of tech, I think that's really important for us to pick these kinds of things and evangelize them a little bit to other people who aren't as tech savvy. And if you're an entrepreneur, and I'm sure there's at least one of you in here, I want to remind you that you don't need to build another unicorn, and you'd probably actually be better off trying to build something a lot smaller. Because I don't know why you even want to become a unicorn, because when you're a unicorn, analysts start getting mad at you when you bring in only $46.08 billion this quarter instead of the projected $46.93 billion. And that kind of sounds miserable. I don't want to kind of live like that. I'd rather just make cool products. And the web is a great place to make products because your little online store is just as easy to get to as one of the world's biggest companies. You just have to type in a URL into a browser, and you're both equally accessible. And that's very refreshing to me. Making money at a small scale is a fairly achievable goal. If you're a single person wanting to run a business, you can be pulling in 6 figures a year with just 1,000 customers paying less than $10 a month. And I think there are a lot of other really interesting business opportunities out there when you're not trying to target like a massive scale. That's actually very limiting. I hope that you don't try to build the next Facebook. I hope that you try to build the next email instead. What I mean by that is all these social networks today are built with scale in mind so that you have to have an account with that specific company. But email is different. Like, it's a protocol. If I have an email address and you have an email address, it doesn't matter what services we use, we can talk to each other. I don't even have to have an account with any specific company. I can run my own email server. It's really easy to do. Even politicians can do it. I don't think anyone really got rich off of creating email, but a lot of value has been created on top of email. And I think that's a really great thing to build. I'd rather build something that other people can get rich on top of than trying to get rich off of a thing myself. And I think there are a lot of other types of applications that would be better if they were built more like that. Like, what if we built a distributed Slack, which we have, it's IRC. But what if we didn't have like a single ride-sharing app like Uber and Lyft, and what if we just had like local ones for each city? Maybe they'd actually manage to like pull a profit that way because they're only running in one city, especially if they can clock in under 4,000 microservices. And I think there's interest in this. Like, people have been talking about blockchains a lot lately, or in the past couple of years, and that probably was mostly because Bitcoin got really expensive and everyone was really excited about that. But there was some interest in decentralization, and I think we should tap into that interest. Jack Dorsey is interested in taking Twitter into being something that works for a decentralized kind of thing. So that's kind of exciting to see that like mainstream industry people are into this too. And I want to leave you with one last thought. Imagine one of these bigger companies like Apple or Amazon or Google or whatever, and think about all the talented engineers and designers and product managers that work for these companies. They've often got hundreds or even thousands of people working on all their products. And I want you to imagine that one of those companies disbanded and all of their employees split up into small groups of people and started making their own products. I think that would be incredible, especially when I look at the kinds of products that I use today that are built by very small teams. I think we'd have a ton of great products out there, and I think the value that all those companies could create would be incredible. But we can't have that because all those people are currently working on some random product at Amazon or Apple or Facebook or Google or Microsoft or whatever. So instead of a rich marketplace with a variety of products to choose from, now we just have a couple choices to choose from, and we just kind of have to hope that the company that we go with is going to keep being interested in the same features that we're interested in. And that, to me, is the ultimate case against scale. Thank you.